The third module today is entitled Environmental, Social and Governance Factors on Pension Fund Investments. Our panelists today are Mike Clark, Lizeth Palencia, and Manuel García, whom I will briefly introduce. Mike Clark is a founding member of Ario Advisory, a responsible investment company. As an actuary, he's focused on climate change, working with asset owners, financial regulators, and people who are politically smart. He was a special advisor to the United Kingdom Parliament's Environmental Audit Committee for its inquiry into green finance. He was a NED, non-executive director at Brunel Local Government Pension Scheme for almost 4 years. And he is a visiting fellow at the Global Systems Institute at the University of Exeter. He is a member of the team that presented real-world narrative scenarios introducing climate risk into the university's retirement plan, a leading UK pension fund, to frame its investment strategy. Let me introduce Lizeth Palencia. Lizeth is the director for Spanish-speaking Latin America at Principles for Responsible Investment, known as PRI, where she is in charge of promoting sustainable investment practices throughout the entire region. Let's change the slide, please. Lizeth Palencia. Before joining PRI, she managed the portfolio of state-owned companies in the energy and financial sectors at the Colombian Ministry of Finance. Lizeth has also contributed to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, where she developed sustainability policies and practices for corporate governance in Latin America, and has served as a board member of different companies in Colombia. Lizeth holds a master's degree in public policy from the Oxford University School of Government and a bachelor's degree in financial engineering from Universidad Autónoma de Bucaramanga, Colombia. Let me introduce now our third speaker. Manuel García Huitrón is an economist from the Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de México, ITAM, with postgraduate studies in universities in Tilburg and Yale, a founding member of Nuola Limitada, a global startup on pensions and longevity risk. His experience includes World Bank, IDB, and executive roles in pension funds in Latin America and Europe. He has taught at Universidad Católica de Chile, Adolfo Ibáñez University, and ITAM. And he's a member of advisory boards, including the one on the Mercer CFA Global Pension Index project and Mesa de Formalidad Laboral in Chile. Distinguished for his contribution to initiatives such as the Future of Work and Data Science of NYU, Smith Features, and Bertelsmann Foundation, among others. He was awarded the Citibanamex Award in Mexico. He has authored many publications in pension, aging, labor markets, and green finance. And let me also add that he is a very good friend of AIOS for more than 10 years already. So I'll give you Mike. Mike will address the audience in English, and you'll have your interpretation devices. And those of you who are connected online, you can choose the language of your choice. Please, Mike.
The floor is yours. Mike, if you don't mind, we can take questions in the middle. Okay? Okay, perfect.
More the merrier.
Lo más importante es que todas las preguntas sean hechas con el micrófono para que los
Questions should be asked using a microphone so everybody can listen to either the translation or the floor. Thank you.
So, good afternoon. To the pension supervisor in Chile, to AIOS, have I pronounced that? AIOS. And it'd be nice to become a long-term friend of AIOS, perhaps. So it's a pleasure to be here. And as I said yesterday, this is my first trip to Santiago, in fact, South America. So I'm learning a lot. And I actually learned a lot about target date funds. So there you go. However, my task today is to talk about climate risk. And because many of you have seen some of these slides yesterday, I'm going to go through some of those quite quickly, because my real interest, my slides are actually quite boring. I'm interested in what you're interested in, the questions, the comments. So I want to get to discussion, the questions as soon as possible. So that's the plan. So you saw this slide yesterday. Humans are pretty bad at uncertainty. Finance is pretty bad at uncertainty. And risk is not good enough because beyond risk there is uncertainty. So on the left-hand side, we have the Earth Doctor looking a little bit worried. On the right-hand side, there's the rest of us. I highlighted this, and I was talking to Sergio just now. One of the things you may be able to do in Latin America is avoid some of the problems that we have had. So this is a public publication from a UK pension fund. And pretend for a minute, if you will, you are a climate scientist, and you look at this and say, so you're saying if in 15 years we're at 4 degrees above, we're going to lose 70 or 60 basis points? It's just mad. So the official scenario modelling, which has been brought into the private sector, basically doesn't work, and a lot of my work recently has been done on that. And I was trying to think how to explain this to economists, because I sort of upset economists sometimes. Economics, we all know about price formation. There's supply, there's demand, they equate, there's a price. But if there is ignored systemic climate risk, and I suggest there is, then price doesn't work, because that ignored supply of risk has no demand. We've ignored the supply, so there's no demand for it, so there's no price. So I guess the question I'm posing to financial regulators is, what are the limits to financial regulation if they're based on price? One of the things I do is talk about who is responsible for what. I mentioned this a little bit yesterday. Do we expect too much of finance? Have governments delegated too much to finance? I suggest they have. This comes from a Bank of England report of 2.5 years ago. Under the Climate Change Act of 2008 in the UK, one part of government can ask other actors in the system to produce a report, and the Bank of England made it very clear, whilst the responsibility and policy tools for driving the transition to net zero sit with government through climate policy and with industry through climate action and innovation, the financial sector has a role to play. And I would certainly argue that in the UK and the US, governments have probably over-delegated finance and expect too much of finance. And that is an interesting issue for regulators. So here's a quick question. I hope this will prompt a discussion later on. It's a financial...
Sí, Manuel.
Yeah.
Just a quick comment on your previous slide. I was reading it and listening to you. I thought I may change it and say net zero sit with governments with an S, because
I agree.
Right?
This was really aimed at our politicians who didn't read it.
But it's really the political economy issue of carbon pricing and coordination and so on, right?
Yes.
So, yes.
My simple story goes political economy, that became economics, that became finance, that became financial risk, and risk was very narrowly defined, and then the outcome of that isn't serving the political economy of governments. So yes, it would be governments generally. They were sort of speaking to the UK government, but absolutely. So here's a question for financial regulators, and I hope it leads to a discussion in the Q&A. Do you think your goal in regulating climate-related risks is decarbonisation of the business model of those you regulate? Is it real-world decarbonisation? Is it business model risk management resilience by those you regulate? Or is it number 3, but with some view on systemic risks? So I'll leave that with a question to think about, and maybe we'll discuss that. I'm going to run through these very quickly. So these are some research pieces which I encourage research departments to engage with. This was published by my profession, actuaries, and the University of Exeter in July of last year, and started pointing out that some of the climate scenarios in the finance sector were not very good. This next one said it more strongly. Basically, the integrated assessment models, which is where climate science meets economics, and the damage functions are frankly pretty hopeless. So I encourage that. I'm not sure if the DICE pun translates into Spanish, but DICE is the climate models, and loading the dice is sort of cheating. So loading the dice against pension funds was a sort of punchy title.
Yes, I want to comment on this yesterday also, but you show here and with the following slides evidence of climate change, right? We know. I mean, it's evidence there is. I think the problem is how to incorporate it, right? In regulation, in the mind of the people, in reality. So.
Which people?
Whoever people, we need to integrate it everywhere. That's the thing. It's like, that's why I asked yesterday. It's when it's the momentum that it make it like a compulsory to incorporate things in general. ESG is a very good example because we are facing change in climate and all the other things that are important. But that's my main question, because I mean, I can read this. I said, yes, there is a change in climate. I know. Oh, and that's it. And that's my problem, because it is not something that it's happening. You know, so the change is happening, but the countries are not adapting. This is what we saw in Paris. This is what we are going to see probably next year also in the meetings.
Yeah.
So that's my main concern with this, because evidence there is, we know. And it doesn't matter. We see people like the ex-president of the United States not believing in climate change. So you cannot be, you are allowed not to believe in when evidence is there, you see?
Okay.
So if you can develop
I think you need to do two things, or possibly one thing. Because finance has generated false complacency, I go back to the pink slide. And if you begin to go in the detail, look at the 5-year numbers. 1.6 degrees minus 20 basis points is much better than 1.5 degrees, 170 basis points. So that non-truth, that lie, is throughout certainly the UK pension system. Not everywhere, because we've talked about USS. But the approach I take in finance is to expose the nonsense, demonstrate the good stuff, and change the mindset. And at the heart of it, I could give you a hypothesis that because we have ignored it, there will be a significant repricing of risk by definition, because if the supply is ignored at some point, that supply crystallizes. That actually generates more apparent risk, but it also pushes the systemic risk out, and I'll come to insurance, which will be another point. So you're right, it's almost sort of where to start, but let's keep going on that. So that's that one. I mean, just picking up that point, the modelers in NGFS, the Network for Greening the Financial System, assumed that we all knew there was lots of uncertainty. But as the message left NGFS and went to central banks around the world and then into the private sector in the UK and elsewhere, we talked about Canada. There's certainly some people in Canada who get this. I've been working with them. In a sense, there was a really false way of thinking about the problem. So this was some work I was involved in last year when we actually wrote narrative scenarios, qualitative scenarios about the real world, so that a pension fund could actually make decisions about their strategic asset allocation that were not framed by modern finance theory. And there's a slide on that later, which I'll come to. This was another report which I co-authored for the UK government via Exeter University. The key tool really is that risk and opportunity analysis. But again, these are just things which are all publicly available, and I'm sure somehow if people want them, we can find ways of getting to you. This was NGFS beginning to move towards the real world. They realised that 30-year scenarios weren't much use for decision making, so they said in October last year, 3 to 5 scenarios are good. That's the decision frame of people. So they moved that way. And then in January this year, they pointed out that there's quite a lot of uncertainty, and I'm not sure you were listening, which is really sort of slightly covering their backs because for some years finance had believed them. And scenario users should seek to tailor their analyses to suit their needs. Well, yes, that doesn't mean that one size fits all with scenarios. And a whole list of things from the real world that weren't in the scenarios or only there partially. That is something that my profession published, Climate Scorpion published a couple of weeks ago. And so this is the actuarial profession trying to be the sort of risk and uncertainty advisors to finance. So carry out a realistic risk assessment, then act on it. Educate and take action on positive tipping points. We talk about tipping points in climate science, which are actually quite scary. But you can have positive tipping points. Think about it as like S-curves of behaviour. And we're promoting this notion of planetary solvency. Insurance regulators have a much lower probability of an acceptable insurance company failure. Well, a very low probability of allowing an insurance company to fail. That probability is much lower than effectively planetary insolvency. So that's just applying actuarial techniques. I talked a bit about modern portfolio theory not working yesterday. Sustainable Finance, this is a great book, highly commended. I'm not on commission. It has 2 tasks, providing adequate risk-adjusted returns and directing capital to where the economy needs it. Which begins to come back to Paulina's point that finance should be redirecting capital to the things that we want and moving it away from the things that we know destroy life as we know it. And the key thing is that modern portfolio theory says risk is the volatility of market prices. Where's the real world in that? It isn't. We look at numbers from the past. So that is beginning to gain a lot of traction. This is a question that we've used for advisors to pension fund asset owners. Maybe it's questions for supervisors, since you don't have asset owners really. Are you comfortable with the assumptions? What aspects of the modelling left out? What aspects of the real world have been left out of the modelling? You'll probably find it's quite a lot. Does the output feel realistic? Go back to that pink slide. No, it doesn't. If in doubt, ask a climate scientist. In Canada, they were talking about getting 1 or 2 climate scientists on the board of pension funds. Ensure qualitative issues are discussed, because a lot of things you can't model, there's no real numbers, so get qualitative issues in discussion. And then, can we ever model uncertainty well, or do we just apply the precautionary principle, lean into it? This is a slide I didn't have yesterday, but I thought for supervisors. So what happens when insurance is not available? Many of you will know that California tried to limit insurance premiums. So State Farm just said, we're gone. Can't charge those premiums, we don't have to play. And the insurance commissioner said, well, hang on just a minute, I'd quite like you on the pitch. So I think a conversation developed. One of the key things, I think the 2 drivers for finance change will be insurance and asset owners. In Florida, we have the Citizens Insurance Company, I think set up by Mr. DeSantis. Insurance companies went bust, so the state, Florida, set up an insurance company. The premiums are probably too low. Ask another actuary. What happens with the claims? Well, if the premiums aren't enough, who owns the insurance company? Who are the underwriters? The fine citizens of Florida. At what temperature does the insurance industry cease to exist? Discuss. And I had the privilege of attending a meeting where I spoke of the IAIS, the International Association of Insurance Supervisors. It was a fact they relied totally on the NGFS scenarios, problem number one. Problem number two, there was very little appreciation of systemic risk. If you're a regulator, you tend to regulate company by company, but where's the systemic risk regulation? Largely absent. I made this one up a few weeks ago, so I am now your insurance regulator, and in the next transition plan that you send me, dear insurer, I'd like you to incorporate the climate tipping points. How's your board incorporating the climate tipping points which we're heading towards? So there's a whole load of questions one can actually turn this into a question, if there were asset owners, from an asset owner to investment manager. I asked this question at a conference last year of investment managers and asked about the insurance companies in my notional portfolio. The investment manager from JP Morgan did not understand the question. One goodish answer was, oh, I'll speak to my analyst and they'll ring the company, to which my reply was, I rather wish you'd spoken to the company before you put my money in it. And there was another answer from somebody else. You'll be familiar with GFANZ. I think one of the challenges with the Glasgow Financial Answer Net Zero, I helped build this, so I have a stake in this one. If you may remember, it was launched, and Mark Carney, who actually contributed, Mark Carney contributed to the USS piece. There was this great, we've got $130 trillion ready to go. That rather let governments off the hook. It was almost like finance can solve this problem. Finance can contribute, but it can't solve it. So this sort of hypothetical message is, dear governments, this is GFANZ speaking, representing finance, banking, insurance, investors. Dear governments, we represent finance. We confirm that we'll play our part, we'll do our thing. But please understand, we view risk through a financial lens, and you governments provide the societal risk, which we operate under. So please don't underestimate governments, your responsibility. Finance cannot meet its responsibilities on climate unless government leads the way. And I gave this in Canada. We talked about the pension funds cannot deliver the pension promise if governments don't deliver on emissions. I just put this in as a slightly pokey slide. There's a lot of interest in voluntary carbon markets. We don't need to go into discussions, but there are some people who think they are probably a net negative at the global level. Compliance carbon markets, where there's emissions trading schemes, we've got one in the European Union, we've got one in the UK, we've got two in the States, we've got them in New Zealand and places. They are well regulated, but some of the things that go on in voluntary carbon markets, I don't know if this translates, would make your hair curl. Does that translate? So just maybe a discussion about that, but I just wanted to flag that voluntary carbon markets could be a problem, and I am told that Mark Carney is moving away from them. I have some good news. This is a project which I actually found out about a couple of weeks ago. It is led by the Grantham Institute at the LSE. Some of you will know that's a very climate-aware grouping. And the title of the project is Towards an Integrated Transition Planning Ecosystem. And I said coming soon because some of this is semi-public and it will be published quite soon. It states, I think many things we all agree, we need a fundamental rewiring of the economy. It's back to Paulina's question. To achieve the ambition of the Paris Agreement, every government, every company needs to respond strategically. I actually believe in Chile you're doing that. I can't say that of my own government in the UK. And it's an issue that's in the G20. There's a lot of focus on the private sector, so we need to extend the focus to embed it in governments, national, subnational, local. Companies and capital providers need confidence to invest. The UK government is in backtracking. That's a really bad message to pension funds. If governments backtrack on climate commitments, where's the trust, where's the commitment? The idea is in the next iteration of NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, there should be a strategic national transition plan. And then they should just be part of a sort of integrated transition plan ecosystem. Reducing uncertainty is key. I think that's back to Pauline's one. It's like there's a lot going on, but what do we need to do? Reducing uncertainty, and reducing uncertainty builds trust. And we need mechanisms to do all those things, including incentivize the different actors in the system so that we do the right thing. As I say, what might you do differently tomorrow? Thank you. Questions, please.
Thank you very much, Mike. Hacemos preguntas ahora, sí. Manuel, también después que ahora viene Lizeth, después de Mike.
Lizeth,
y también
after
podemos
Mike,
hacer una ronda de discusión cuando termine Lizeth. Te doy la palabra ahora y
when Lizeth is done.
¿Por qué? Porque
Manuel will present the IDB strategy, so it's somewhat outside this discussion framework. So we have some time for Q&A before Manuel's presentation.
That we humans have invented to deal with risks, right? So it's basically either you diversify it, either you hedge it, either you dynamically hedge it, or which is kind of the same as insure it, or you transfer it, or you share risks among populations.
Let's stick with those and say you can also look at risks through a real-world lens and decide what you want to lean into and what you'd like to lead away. So some leading UK pension funds have said, so this is not investment managers. I was conscious when I say asset owners, people say it doesn't apply to us, then maybe it's the regulator's job, but we'll discuss that. They have said we do not want to put our beneficiaries' money into oil and gas. We've engaged for 5 years trying to persuade them to change. It's a waste of time. It's not going to happen. So we'll take our beneficiaries' money away, because we do not want to invest that money in things that will destroy their retirement. You then get to rather interesting discussions. Some of you will be familiar with the concept of passive management. You just invest in line with an index. Now, a lot of people think that's cheap, but if I'm paying a few basis points to invest passively in a global equity fund, which is just automatically channeling money into the oil and gas sector, is that cheap for my beneficiaries? Possibly not. So there's a big discussion, well, not a big discussion, a discussion some of us have started around passive management and, you know, the automatic use of an index that actually is not in the beneficiary's interest. So there's a whole load. What I'm trying to get you is to expand the concept of risk. Cautionary principle, lean into good risks, lean away from bad risks. I think I may have told this story yesterday. Let's just do it again. So Bailey Gifford, investment manager, bought lots of Tesla 15 years ago. People said, you're mad, far too expensive, they said. And this is with hindsight. They said, no, we knew markets would reprice risk. And they did make lots of money, because markets reprice risk so that Tesla made a lot of money in the markets. So I just think having this sort of mindset of risk in markets, which is hard, because I guess unless we're actuaries, we don't often think about risk quite as deeply. But thinking about markets and risk pricing, I made the slightly cheeky suggestion this morning that a pensions regulator could decide they had a view on climate risk in markets, and you don't need regulation. Regulators have a lot of power when they just say things, and if they said, let's do Chile, you know, we're not convinced that capital markets have got climate change right. Trying not to look at Sergio. We're not convinced that that capital markets have got climate risk right. So we need to signal to the players in the markets we influence that we have that view. Now that's not a regulation, that's just wisdom. So I think I'm just trying to get you out of the finance theory we both grew up with.
Yes.
And say, make that gap between financial risk and real-world risk, and you begin to think differently. That's exactly what's happening at USS, the University's Superannuation Scheme. it's hard to say this with humility, but that was a world first. There are 4 scenarios. If I get asked a question, I can bore you for 10 minutes on the details. But the 4 scenarios, which are real-world scenarios, which actually I put as an appendix to this. So, I mean, this was just in case this was useful to this group, policy, high policy, low policy intervention, markets, low and high. Top right, I always have nice trendy names for scenarios. So the Roaring Twenties is probably a scenario that gets us to Paris. Bottom left, meltdown clearly doesn't. And so in those written scenarios, which are just plausible, possible futures, not forecasts, just ways of thinking about the real world, which is not how asset owners thought about beta, their strategic asset allocation, and that is driving the assets of the USS pension fund. And the first bit is all public. That's the paper I referred to earlier. USS wanted it to be a public good, so although they paid us to do the work, it's out there. We're currently doing phase 2 and keeping away, as I said yesterday, keeping away from numbers for as long as possible. So heat maps, you know, where are the places we like to go positively, where we like to move away negatively, no numbers. We'll get to numbers at some stage, you have to. So long answer to a good question.
No, thank you. I mean, what you would like to see is regulators being more aggressive on in terms of having a view of climate risks and kind of setting some parameters probably for the modeling of that climate risk at the pension fund level.
Let's take that gently. I think we all need to do more. It's back to Paulina's point. We're all in this together. So depending on what your role is, or what you think tomorrow would be acceptable, a bit braver, I love this phrase, increasing people's agency. There's a big there's a big difference between a financial regulator, and this may not always apply here. There's a big difference between a financial regulator and the government and non-financial regulators. For the reasons I stated, governments and non-financial regulators do societal risk. We in finance just do financial risk. So we can do so much. So it's happening. I think nudging is the technical phrase, the pensions regulator in the UK. Because the pensions regulator has seen both the nonsense on the pink slide, and there's lots of that, and the USS, the pensions regulators are understanding that the way we have been led by the NGOS scenarios is not helpful. I think that's the polite way of putting it. So they are beginning to make more noise. They're not regulating, they're just saying, you know, we're a bit interested in this, so they just ask for more information, more data. I'm hoping that will encourage the Bank of England, who in the UK, through the PRA, regulate banks and insurers, to move on, because in the banks and insurance world, it is typically a compliance thing. So they do lots of numbers and some modeling, and that's fine, because we've kept the financial regulator happy. I had a conversation a year ago now with a guy at a bank, said that's complex, really good, lots of effort. How has it affected your board's strategy? He looked rather sheepish and went, not at all, just a compliance exercise. Now the joy is, in the UK, with asset owners who get it, they're the board, they're the fiduciaries, they're at the top. So they drive this through the system. And in fact, they can now ask questions about insurance coming into the portfolio. So there's I don't know if you're a sort of systems theory, systems thinking person, but the more you can do this in a systems thinking sense, you see the interconnections between different players, and that really helps.
Thank you very much. So we continue with Lizeth, y después tenemos una sesión de discusión. Lizeth, por favor, adelante. Cambiamos entonces a la presentación de Lizeth Palencia.
Let's please show Lizeth Palencia's presentation.
La presentación, muy bien, gracias.
Listo. Muchísimas gracias nuevamente pues por la invitación a abordar todos estos temas de ESG que han sido pues relativamente recientes en nuestra región. Así como lo hablaba Mike hace unos minutos, lo hablábamos
before, as we discussed yesterday during the session, the political action is urgent. The more we take, the more disruptive these topics will be regarding politics, and the financial market should operate on those planetary limits that we discussed. So today, I will discuss those policy aspects and the fact that they need to be included in the regulation in the region. Just to remind us all, PRI operates on 6 principles. I'm going to focus on number 4 and 5, specifically why we need to promote the effective introduction of these criteria and why we need to work collaboratively to be able to advance this agenda in the region. So the first thing is that we need a much more goal or objective oriented world, and that politics should be focused on these topics. Globally, we have established sustainability goals that have been widely discussed in the Paris Agreement, in the SDGs, and the World Framework on Biodiversity approved in during COP15. But we have trends that are quite concerning socially and environmentally. We have lack of financing. 6 of the 9 planetary limits have been crossed, and we have increasing inequality. There are different countries at the same time that have been approving different transition policies that are intending to be aligned with those objectives in a more global way. However, from governments, there needs to be a much more comprehensive vision regarding all these economic transition topics. First of all, we need economic transition needs to be a core objective of public policy making. How does this interact with other macroeconomic factors, and how this policy considers all the international and scientific, eco-scientific consensus? This should include governance from the top levels of the government, and that should apply to all entities involved. Third, how what we have established is introduced through different transition policies, and here's where we establish the sustainability path, the short, medium, and long-term sustainability objectives, and investment needs. Finally, one before last, political levers that allow us to leverage all these transition policies that we have established nationally. That is to say, how we can provide solutions. How do we address subsidies, for example, to certain industries that are supporting all these transition topics? How do we give out credible signals regarding the development of all these topics? How do we enable finance, both public and private? And how do we align public budgeting processes with all these objectives? And something that is quite relevant, the role of responsibility is in the hands of the government of discussing these topics. We need international collaboration of multilateral organizations that have a vast experience in technical assistance and different geographies supporting on these topics, and non-state actors that are involved in these discussions to achieve those objectives between 2030 and 2050. The fact of focusing this presentation today on the legal framework, well, last year, PRI, together with Generation Foundation and UNEP FI, commissioned this study, a legal framework for impact, in order to do this, they conducted quite an innovative study in 11 jurisdictions that you can see on the left of this slide, where they analyze whether in fact economies allow or even require investors to address some of these more urgent objectives. Pursuing these objectives goes beyond introducing these ESG topics, but investors should effectively introduce or to achieve positive results associated to sustainability and how they align all their portfolios towards the achievement of keeping global warming below 1.5 degrees of increase. The results for all these publications have been already socialized, and next I'm going to share the rationale behind of these conclusions. First of all, what is the rationale that financial investments and economic activity drives the results in topics such as climate change, sustainable development, and human rights? And this is partially this is happening partially regardless whether these objectives are sought after or not by investors. The purpose of pension funds is investing their assets to generate financial yield that will provide income during retirement years to the beneficiaries. And the duty of investment managers is to be a loyal, skillful, and careful in using all the faculties that they should have. But it is possible that there may be a high correlation or alignment between the achievement of the sustainability goals and the interests of pension funds. On the one hand, the pension funds are long-term investors. On the other hand, in order to achieve sustainability goals, one needs financing in the long run, in the long term, that will enable to leverage all these topics or the transition plans that are established in all our countries. And on the other hand, pension funds need to have capacity to generate a yield of their long-term investments, which can be potentially threatened by all these risks. Under certain circumstances, investors should address the impacts of sustainability to be able to manage all these risks, but this is not considered as the most common practice in our markets. Especially in Latin America, screening is the typical practice, but this is not part of the risk model to be able to evaluate the assets. So this study explored how this sector can respond to ESG aspects, looking for a positive impact on the sustainability of the real world, and especially how to shift from how to manage investment or the effect of a risk opportunity in ESG in the portfolios to address how investors can contribute or guarantee that their portfolios have a positive impact in the world. What does the law says? It is still quite predominant that financial performance is the main purpose and the main objective of investors. But as I said before, possibly investors may have the legal obligation of considering how these outcomes may help them achieve their financial objectives. Once again, these sustainability risks are very important because they may threaten the ability of those pension funds to meet their financial obligations in the long run. We also have some regulations in several geographies in which they force investors or commit them to address all these topics when they offer financial products associated to sustainability. That's when we find that there's a gap where we need political reform to be able to cast some light on all these topics. We have found that in the design of the policies there are still objectives that are unclear. There are many positions regarding the introduction of all these criteria that are voluntary in nature, that are not necessarily aligned with these transition plans that have been established nationally, and that there's very little monitoring of the compliance with these topics, and that's when we have the whole implementation gap. So in order to exemplify how they achieve sustainability results, this is the case of an asset owner with an approach on climate change and how They intentionally try to align 100% of their asset under management with listed companies that are aligned with net zero or equivalent criteria for 2030 and extending it to all sectors as of 2040. And in order to do that, they conduct several activities associated to policy promotion, how they allocate their assets to investments on climate and energy transition, also how they demand that from their investment, that 100% should consider emissions, dissemination, decarbonization objectives, how they measure their footprint and the balance in their portfolio. On the other hand, dissemination or disclosure by investors is absolutely necessary. There are at least 15 different information disclosure systems. Sometimes some companies are even lost inside all these frameworks. There are clear reasons to demand investors why they need to disclose this information in order to protect themselves, in order to give the right information to the beneficiaries, to address green hushing and greenwashing topics, to assess risk position, and to allow regulators to collect data of all the entities that you supervise to better understand the exposure to these risks. Also, we have the need to align this in a much more global format. This fragmentation we see in different reporting frameworks reduces transparency, which is key to precisely achieve regulatory objectives. It adds complexity to reporting and consumes resources from all stakeholders because of having to report using different reportability frameworks that are very lengthy. It expands instead of closing the data gap, something that we discussed yesterday, and it is the need to have data in order to assess all these risks. It reduces investors' trust on the products that we consider to be green, and it may also increase geopolitical tensions because of the differences we find in all these reporting frameworks. Finally, the question that Paulina asked yesterday about all these topics, there are different regulatory approaches. The first one is precisely to address all these risks regarding sustainability, and many of the regulators in Latin America are adapting to this, such as CONSAR in Colombia and here in Chile. The superintendency is that the AFPs should include these criteria among their investment processes, and that in turn they can consider governance and strategy aspects, but also in terms of identifying exposure to risk using scenarios or using metrics is not a common practice in our markets. Also, there are other two regulatory approaches that are being addressed by part of the European, UK or European disclosure framework that addresses these sustainability-related risks, specifically systemic risks. And there are clear objectives established with sustainability objectives, developing strategies including management, allowing to adapt or to apply all these topics, and how progress is assessed. For example, how is this connected with taxonomy? And finally, how this supports transition, introducing the elements in the previous column, but additionally, it also introduces individual products, how progress has been made in these topics, and although it's not exhaustive as an example, but it's part of the UK and European regulation. Now, what are those specific recommendations after this analysis or legal analysis that was done in this study? The first one is that policy frameworks must be consistent and comprehensive. Pension funds should know clearly what is that policy framework in which they are integrating all these factors, considering the boundaries that they face regarding risk and liquidity, and how can they look for these sustainability results which are highly relevant to achieve the compliance of all these country objectives. Second, it should clearly distinguish between ESG risks and what are sustainability results. One must recognize what are those differences and or through which measures pension funds can go beyond the integration of ESG topics to look sustainability results that are aligned much more broadly with the members and beneficiaries. Third, how, what we mentioned before, how they issue standardized reports regarding sustainability objectives. Reports provide information about the degree to which they have been able to comply with these objectives, and they allow investment managers to be aligned with these best practices, and that they are available in a format that is accessible and easy to read for beneficiaries. Number 4, that there should be adequate guidance about the sustainability credentials of pension funds. That is to say, how they can effectively demonstrate these aspects in terms of products associated to sustainability, and how can they guarantee the disclosure of all these strategies that they've adopted, and that they should not create unnecessary restrictions regarding the types of strategies that they can adopt in the funds, in order not to create inadequate incentives regarding innovation in the products that they offer. Now, regarding the investment practices, and on the other side of the fence, what do we need? Education and data. First, how to educate beneficiaries, which was one of the things we discussed yesterday, and that they should commit to the sustainability goals, how beneficiaries receive information and how are they involved and engaged in complying these goals, and that they also demand that from pension funds, and how their opinions are reflected in the strategies adopted by pension funds. Likewise, fiduciaries and these managers should also be able to adapt and to have relevant knowledge in all these matters regarding sustainability. They should be willing, based on the creation of capacity, they should be willing to go beyond the traditional investment strategies that are available, allowing them to achieve these positive sustainability results, and how vendors are aligned precisely with all these initiatives in order to support pension funds in order to achieve these goals and to have much more robust databases. And that is my presentation and the results of the analysis. Thank you very much.
Very interesting. So, Lizeth will go back to her seat and we will open up the floor for questions. Remember to turn your name tag, and that will allow you to have access to questions. So, the floor is open. Mike, you want to say something? I'm going to answer in Spanish, if I may.
Listo.
And that is precisely one of the important challenges. And I was saying that in the discussion, currently we have many different reporting frameworks. And currently in Latin America, unfortunately, these topics is almost like a basic service for many of the investors in order to identify which are the points in which they can improve, which are some of the things, the new things that they need to implement. Yet it is important because the current view and all of the strategy that's being designed is that investors should focus more on this practice rather than in all of these reports. Yet it is key to have a certain consistent standard around the whole region that can allow us to identify and to give transparency to investors, regulators, but also to all the beneficiaries. So with the new adaptation, with the new changes, many of the regulators in Latin America have been working with the recommendations from the TCFD that were adopted through the IAST and which have moved forward in trying to adapt standards that are a lot more global and not specific at the country level. So I think that this is key and that it can be interoperable between the different jurisdictions too.
Africa, they missed out landlines. We're going to avoid all this scenario nonsense, and we're just going to ask for transition plans. Would that work? Would that fly? A transition plan doesn't need data. Anybody who says, I need data, says, well, you make decisions without full data every day. Don't use that as an excuse. So I'm just floating the idea that transition plans might accelerate change because you can do a pretty good transition plan on 5 or 6 pieces of paper. And the transition plan says this organization is going to tackle climate change with this transition plan. Here's our goals. There's some high-level metrics. You know, over the first year, we're going to increase the resources. It's all very sort of qualitative. It's organizational change. It's not data. And that's the sort of, I think part of the challenge is that, you know, we love data in finance. Actuaries love data. But actually, this is about sort of human behavior and organizational change. And I just wonder if in this part of the world, there's a lesson that, you know, a bit like we go back to Africa and mobile phones, we don't need all the data. I mean, yes, you need data to make investment decisions, but as a driver for change, you know, we didn't get the Paris Agreement because of the data. We got the Paris Agreement because we realized we had a problem. So the Paris Agreement doesn't have a lot of data in it. It just has sort of, here's a plan. So I'm just sort of exploring the idea with you, whether you think from your wide knowledge of the region, whether a sort of flip to transition plans might work. I don't know.
Can you repeat the last part, please?
Whether just saying, you know, we need transition plans because that's how things change. So, you know, the board or whoever, the executive gets together and says, you know, we need a plan. So you start with the plan, you start with the governance, not with the data. So I'm just sort of interested in exploring that. Because I'm very conscious there's, you know, the regulators in the UK, we do what the regulators say, but they have driven us down a path, and it's partly my fault. We've driven the finance industry down a path which sort of says data and reporting is what you need to do. I'm just sort of wondering if Latin Americans skip some of that and be more active more quickly rather than just reporting.
Yo creo que sí. Y por ejemplo, muchas de
think
las
that it could
taxonomías
be because
que se están
many of the
desarrollando acá en América
economies
Latina
that are
están precisamente
developing in
basadas
Latin
en lo que ha
America
sido
are
las experiencias de
based
la
on
Unión
the
Europea. Y
experiences
yo creo que
from
eso nos
the
ha permitido a
European
nosotros
Union, and I think that we have learned from that, or it has allowed us to avoid some of the trial and error that some other jurisdictions have gone through. It is key, and we've not started from the data here. We've started more from action in establishing these transition plans, considering that many of our economies countries depend on oil mines. They depend on these natural resource sectors that have quite a lot of the GHG emissions. But it's now important to now bring this down towards more concrete actions that should allow us to start actually implementing those transition plans, those plans that were set up in the different countries. And then when the decision-making comes, I think that data is important so that we can monitor and follow up. But in Latin America, I think that we started with this action, as you have mentioned, and now we're looking into how we can monitor and integrate this more effectively. But it's important to fast-track all of these. I think that we have a tremendous potential in the region in order to provide the world with some innovative solutions that can allow us to address these issues. Yes, you don't quite know, but last year we had the meeting in Mexico, and an important part of that discussion that we had on ESG at that point in time, the European regulators and the European industry showed us some of the mistakes that they had made that are not being made nowadays in Latin America. I would also like to highlight that Latin America has, 80% of the lungs, so as to speak, of this planet, and that is an asset also in terms of how we can contribute. So yes, we have talked about all of these. We've talked about that. It's been a topic that's been on the table in the past, and this is why now we can see that data is now important. We're at a stage where it is important. We know what we have to do, but we don't have granular or transparent or available information in order to now be able to work with the information that we need in order to continue moving forward. Now, before passing the floor to Manuel, does anybody else have any questions? Sergio, go ahead. It's actually not a question. I think that there are several points here that were mentioned that are quite heterogeneous or are actually quite... we need to bring them down to earth, and we need to really start looking at the applications. The net zero 2050, that sounds lovely, doesn't it? But how can we actually get there? What costs does that imply? What are the benefits that brings about for the investors? The asset manager and also the asset owner have the obligation, in our case, of creating pensions. But we cannot destroy the planet in doing so. So it's extremely important that we have clear strategies, and when investing, which is the investment, which is the important information, because it's not one size fits all. Each company, each sector, each asset manager must have their data set, and we cannot forget that. We must keep that in mind. So it's very important that we have regulations that promote these. The objective is to provide pensions in these, but the state must oversee the alignment of different interests. The main role of pension funds is not to transform the world, but it must provide support for this transformation as long as interests are well aligned. So we must not forget that, and I'm very proud for Chile and its strategy, which I believe it's very clear, very transparent, and it has been published and it's being implemented. And I think that that's a good example to follow that avoids many of the mistakes that were made in Europe, and even the taxonomy that we are developing based on what's in Colombia, based on what's in Europe also. It's trying to seek for innovation, for example, when it comes to mining, and it's trying to implement that in practical terms, not only theoretical terms, and that's extremely important. If I may, just to supplement that, that's precisely what you have said is very important. We have to change that mindset, leaving these commitments and really start moving forward into action. The numbers exist, the evidence is there, things are not going well climate-wise, so it's important to leave the paper aside and to start seeing actions. And one of the big mistakes is that although the financial sector does play an important role in all of these transition topics, they're not the saviors, they're not the saviors of the planet, and they're not in charge of solving all of these problems. So from the regulation end, the signals, the appropriate signals must be sent out so that the owners can actually fund all of these projects that are presented from the government. Thank you for that, Lizeth. Just to end this part of the session then, I would like to know our approach as AIOS to the TRI comes from Sashka, right, which we learned about 2.5 years ago. So how can a PRI help us in all of this process that's coming? Well, let me tell you about the strategy that we have been working on PRI, which is currently undergoing the consultation process, but there's an important focus on emerging markets among which Latin America is, and providing the regulators support in all of these topics on public policies and how they can integrate all of these issues. There's a team in charge of or specialized in public policies, and the idea is to start bringing you about, reaching you, because there have been important efforts in Mexico with Eric, with Martha, to include the Afores in all of these topics. In Chile also, there have been efforts that have been undertaken voluntarily on how to move forward with the agenda, just like in Colombia. But the idea is to expand this knowledge throughout the region so that we can move forward quickly too. So in PRI, we're more than open. This is a very good moment, me being here in this event, to get to know you and to offer all of the technical support from PRI on these matters. And I'm more than happy to be able to continue talking in other different spaces around these matters. Okay, the last two comments, Octavio Balinas, and then we will finish with Mike Clark before going to the presentation from Miguel. Okay, Mike has called us to start moving into action, and the demand for instruments, the demand of the saving systems, the mandatory savings system, the problem that we're facing here actually is trying to see everything quantitatively. And we end up on this, talking about pension funds and the need for information. We have to acknowledge that pension funds have the need of channeling funds for an investment that has to provide returns. So the regulation should be thinking more qualitatively on how these resources can be channeled and funneled towards other activities. But also on the other end, we're talking about the demand for instruments. The supply of instruments should also generate regulations, especially that can create trust, because the dependency on data, because there's a need to have a KPI so that we can be certain that the resources are destined to what we have said that they're going to be destined. So we have these two sides of the coin that have to migrate towards a more qualitative approach and must be also linked together so that progress and the channeling of the resources can move faster. If we're waiting for a whole reporting framework that allows me to have an risk credit index, it's going to be too long. Thank you, Octavio and Mike.
Case, and I'm picking up the sense it is, that in much of this part of the world, there is much closer alignment between government policy and where finance is and the risk thoughts. It's actually not how PRI can help AIOS, but it's actually the other way around, because if there is a message around political economy in, let's say, Southern America, actually that message being fed back through PRI, as in, you're listening, everybody else, and we think we can help you with it. There is that alignment of societal risk management, governance and finance. That's actually a message that PRI can almost take back to we Westerners, because we financialized it. If you don't do that too much, you make it a sort of real economy issue, and that's the way we're going to solve the problem in this part of the world. That actually might be quite a sort of AIOS message back to the rest of us. Just a thought. I mean, it just emerged out of that conversation. Thanks.
Thank you, Mike. And indeed, I rephrase, it's cooperation. And that's why you are invited tomorrow to the session where the countries are going to tell us what has happened the last year. Sorry, pensé que estaba hablando castellano. Pero es importante porque
so it is important because it's cooperation. That's what's actually needed, especially on these particular topics that Lizeth was addressing. And that is why tomorrow, in the recent events session, which is very important for us, we're going to listen to all the regulators. They all tell us what has happened in the last year and what are some of the future trends. So for the presenters that are here today, you're welcome to participate tomorrow, because this is what we as regulators can directly offer. We tell you firsthand what it is that is more important in each of the different countries regarding regulation. Manuel, my apologies, I called you Miguel. Manuel García then will have the last presentation in this panel, and then we will go for a coffee break before the very last session of the day.
Thank you, Paulina. Okay, thank you. I was just telling Paulina that Miguel is the former boyfriend of my wife, and I've been called Miguel several times. No, but I'm fine. It's fine. It's never mind. I just wanted to break the ice a little bit, because I know it's late and I know that we are tight. My mission right now is to show you an initiative, a new one from IDB, in which we hope to have your support and your enthusiasm, and something that we're going to start in the coming, not months, but weeks, I would say. So, really, I had thought, well, I prepared a couple of slides to start, to summarize what my colleague Waldo presented yesterday. Maybe he went through this very quickly. But with the excellent presentations we've attended to, I don't need to repeat myself here. I'm just going to emphasize a couple of things. One of them is the kind of work we will be able to deliver through the technical secretariat. We're about to publish this, which is a technical document that Waldo mentioned yesterday. It is a very broad document. In orange, here you can see all the topics. And really, there is so much about this topic that it's difficult to add value, I would say. So what we tried to do is to come up with a couple of things that may be, I don't know if different, but that could add a little value. And one of them, which is the one that I'd like to focus on, is first of all, in the note, we tried not only to focus on what are the international frameworks, the actions adopted by multilateral institutions, the theory and practice and case studies, as Waldo said yesterday, but also the connection among all of this in order to find some cohesion in everything that's done. And secondly, we presented the results of a survey that we ran in Chile. Fernando Lopez, who was with us yesterday and who co-authored this article, and he helped us run a survey here in Chile to see what is the citizens' perception. This is a new view, a different view, regarding either introducing or not introducing, and then the implications of introducing ESG or sustainability factors into pension fund investment decisions. I will skip a lot of this. I'm not going to bore you with this. But on the right, I just wanted to very quickly mention some of these results because I thought they were quite, I don't know what adjective to use. I expected something different. Interestingly enough, my approach was different, but the survey, and I will focus on this, found that citizens, respondents, were willing to consider or to start talking about these ESG topics, but with caution. They're not willing to. Once again, one needs to check the format of the questions. If you ask somebody, do you agree with doing something to fight climate change? Nobody is against it. But now, if there's a second question saying, okay, but are you aware of the fact that if this happens, there may be a chance that returns may not be the same? Well, that's when things change. And the fact is that they are willing to do it, but it was a positive result. They are willing to do it as long as this contributes to their future pension. So I thought, I don't know if this is going to resonate in your countries. I wanted to ask Mark because they conduct lots of research on this. And maybe Lizeth has some further data, but I believe it was extremely interesting. It would be very interesting to do this in other countries, and that's, of course, it's a much broader survey. I'm not going to dwell on that because what I really wanted to present is this new initiative, which is, and I love the way in which this last session ended, in a very practical note, a very enthusiastic note, I would say, because precisely this is when initiatives like this have a space, have some room. How can we channel resources in order to fund this transition? Well, to give you an idea, the name of the study is there, and how to unlock and to motivate institutional investors' participation, not only in pension funds, and I'm going to cover that as well, in the local green bond markets and also in direct investments on projects that may lead to a low carbon economy. Renewables, infrastructure, cities, etc., etc., etc. So basically, this is about conducting a review and seeing how the laws in capital markets and how capital markets or equity markets are operating, and how to find improvement opportunities, and seeing how to precisely promote and how to catalyze those resources towards this transition. Now, what are we talking about? In fact, Lizeth and others have said that there's good news in Latin America, especially in the last few years. We have seen an acceleration of what is going on in terms of regulation, as well as what's happening in terms of the capitals market. Basically, in Brazil today, most of the infrastructure projects are funded through the equity market. Lizeth mentioned what the consequences are in terms of changes in regulation in Chile, etc. However, the deficit or the gap, the investment gap, the investment gap for a green transition in Latin America is $1 trillion. That is the challenge for the next decade. Thinking of 2030. This is not trivial, of course, and the question is, what can we do? What is it that is preventing, on the demand side, the fact that there is a much stronger drive, and what can we do to accelerate this? And this is what we have seen so far, and especially accelerated in the last few years, especially in Brazil, Mexico, Uruguay, Chile, that are running innovations, and that are a bit more than $50 billion. This is a trillion. Those are billions of dollars that are exchanged in the market. A bit more than 300 issuances and a bit more than 200 issuers. That is the situation currently, and that is the challenge, but it's also the big opportunity that exists as Latin America in the coming years. So this project, its intention, once again, is to, we're not going to sit down, but for practical terms, we're going to run a survey that we're going to send to a number of institutional investors, the most important pension funds, sovereign funds, insurance companies, etc., and others, central banks. So it's a very ambitious project in terms of who are the target audiences from which we would like to learn and understand their vision of how to achieve a higher degree of participation in these types of markets in Latin America. And there's a focus on 4 countries. If you ask me what is the output, of course, there's going to be a number of recommendations, and we hope they're going to be quite practical and quite powerful. And one chapter on Brazil, Mexico, Peru, and Colombia. Why these 4 countries? Basically, they are the donors that are funding the project. The donor of the project requested for these countries to be included in the study. But when presenting this to you, of course, I understand that the audience is much more broad. It's much broader. So, as long as we delve deeper into these countries, I'd like to leave you with the message that this project intends to have a much broader impact compared to only delving deeper into these 4 countries. Of course, first of all, by studying the best practices. We have Chile. We heard about Chile yesterday. We heard the case of the things that they're doing in Uruguay. And secondly, in terms of disclosure and dissemination about the results. Now, in terms of the components, this is too much detail probably, but basically what we're going to do is that we are going to map and classify these potential market participants, and we are going to try to identify what kinds of emerging solutions exist and under what circumstances or conditions they might operate to increase institutional investors' participation in the region. And a second part, which has to do with sharing knowledge, to develop training and educational tools, and finally, to do a review and to provide practical suggestions regarding regulatory frameworks and their reforms, and market structures as well. Basically, it is reviewing about how capital equity markets operate, a mapping of those, and a survey and an analysis of such a survey to see what are the recommendations in that regard. The project donor, an IDB, would like for us to introduce a gender approach as well. And of course, in Chile, yesterday we heard about the case that Chile is precisely doing this, because this is a cross-cutting topic, and it is very important, of course. There is quite compelling evidence that has been reviewed, the fact that women have significant disadvantages in terms of the impact of climate change overall on society and on communities, because of the roles they play in also economic and health-related impacts. So, and of course, the evidence that exists is quite robust, saying that the positive impact that they may have on the economies, the fact of promoting more well-being, participation in the labor market by changing cultural patterns towards women in Latin America and in the world. So, and also taking or adopting an inclusive approach based on gender and on gender. Depending on the project that is funded, for example, with the green bond, well, that has the potential of actually touching many of the, or impacting many of the sustainability development goals of the United Nations. So we hope it's going to be a quite powerful approach. Of course, I'm going to skip this as well. I just wanted to say that we're going to run a survey, and that will be quite at the beginning. And this is how we are going to knock on doors, on your doors probably, and invite you to be involved, invite you to work with us in this project. Regulators, you as pension regulators, of course, you have an extremely important role to play. And specifically for the project, as I said, we are going to run a survey, and it is, of course, much easier if we have regulators' support compared to just having IDB working on its own without the local support. Well, there's going to be of course, the idea. You as regulators are extremely busy, and you don't want IDB to send you 200 pages of things. No, surveys are basically for institutional investors, not for regulators to see. But obviously, what we would like to do is to have their support, the regulators' support, and there are several moments or stages in the project that we can, as it evolves, we'll start calling on you. And finally, let me close by saying that in several parts or stages of the project, we're going to be coordinating with PRI, and we will be doing several things together because, as Paulina mentioned, this is a time for collaboration, and there are the idea is not to duplicate the efforts. So that's what I wanted to present on behalf of the Equity Markets Division at IDB, and in collaboration with the Labor Markets Unit as well. Thank you. Before saying thank you, really, I just wanted to say that I will be here the rest of today and tomorrow. And what I would love to do is, of course, right now we have more questions than answers. But what I would love to do is to receive from you just maybe some input as to what you think in general, if there's anything in what I presented that is a concern of yours or that you see as risky. I believe this is the right time for us to consider that in our project plan. If you see that there may be some kind of resistance or reluctance in a specific sector, well, it is very important for us to receive this feedback to mitigate those potential risks or to introduce or incorporate your initial comments into the project planning. That's it. Thank you. Thank you, Manuel.